we need to realize that when fuel starts to get low, the brain will start to throw up signals very early that there's a problem. And it'll be the first thing. Even before you get anywhere near of running out of fuel, the brain will start budgeting things differently. Your cognitive functions, like your ability to do math or remember a phone number, will start to go down. Generally, the first sign I see in athletes is their mood starts to go down. So if you start to feel a little bit low, just a little bit low, boy, you better start slamming some calories pretty quickly. It's giving you a signal before things get into a bad state, because it's always trying to keep us alive.
You're listening to Endurance Unlimited, a TrainingPeaks podcast for athletes and coaches, no matter what you're training for. Dial in those workouts with deep insights and cutting-edge science from the most prominent voices in the endurance and hybrid sports world. Before we get into the show, I wanted to let you know our best deal of the year is here. Save 25% on Athlete Premium to plan, execute, and analyze your workouts to hit your upcoming goals. Use the code CYBER2025 when you go to TrainingPeaks.com to sign up, renew, or upgrade your account. Plus, with Premium, you can ride TrainingPeaks Virtual, the indoor cycling platform that lets you upload a GPX file to ride any route in the world and sync seamlessly with your athlete account. Want to strengthen your relationship with your coach? Premium provides additional communication and planning tools. Again, use Cyber2025 at TrainingPeaks.com. This offer ends December 1st, 2025, so don't miss out. My guest today is Dr. Scott Frey, an author, neuroscientist, and psychologist. He has a PhD in experimental psychology from Cornell University and spent his postdoc in cognitive neuroscience at Dartmouth Medical School. He's a true pioneer in the field of neuroscience and how it relates to endurance athletics. He is the founder of Cerebral Performance, a comprehensive program that uses the latest advances in science to optimize athletic performance and wellness. We dive into the importance of brain fatigue and how it affects decision-making, reaction times, rate of perceived exertion, and many other aspects of high performance. Dr. Frey also explains how he has introduced brain training into traditional training programs to help athletes of all levels perform better. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. I definitely have a new respect for how the brain regulates our finish line results. Top to bottom. Scott Frey, thanks a lot for joining me here in person. We rarely do this, so awesome to have you here.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun, Dirk. Thanks for having me down.
Yeah, in the flesh. Before we get to the theory and thought of brain training, give me more of your background and how did you get into this wacky world?
Yeah, well, it's not a straight or linear path, I'll tell you that. So early on, I developed two kind of fascinations, and both came about somewhat serendipitously. I became very interested in the brain because my mom suffered from multiple sclerosis, and my mom raised me by herself. So thinking about the implications of what happens when the brain isn't functioning well, a disease of the central nervous system, which gradually erodes physical capacity and in somewhat cognitive capacity and so on. That was the environment I grew up in. And I was super close with my mom. It was just the two of us. And that had a profound impact in shaping the direction I chose to go with my career. And my other passion was I discovered running late in my teens. I went to a tiny school in rural upstate New York. Played all the sports poorly because if you had a pulse, you were on the team in my school. They needed bodies. But none of them really resonated that well. I wasn't great at ball sports. And when I started running, almost immediately, I loved how it made me feel. And I never stopped running until I cooked the cartilage in my knee after probably 40 years of running races from track to, marathons. And those two passions really continued throughout my life. So I developed this direction through studying psychology initially. And then after getting a PhD in research psychology, kind of experimental psychology, all this new technology opened up the possibility of, for the first time, looking at a living human brain and being able to see what's going on when people are experiencing emotions, perceiving the world through their senses, um, retrieving a memory, manipulating attention. We could actually finally get to see the mechanisms underlying these incredible human behaviors, learning new skills, and so on. So I was started out my career as a assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts, doing pretty straightforward psychology experiments, really interested in perception and how we use our senses to control our movements. And I left my tenure track job to go up to Dartmouth College, where they had one of the earliest magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, machines fully devoted to this new science of studying the brain. And I spent about 7 years up there. And then I moved to the University of Oregon and was a professor there for about a decade, ran the Brain Imaging Center. And then, as I was telling you earlier, my last stop on the academic journey was University of Missouri, where they recruited me and my team and had this brand new brain imaging center. And just, we were able to do a lot of really interesting things. And all that time, I kept doing running, and then that kind of transmogrified into falling in love with cross-country skiing pretty early on. But having no training, no coaching, getting a bike, doing the bike thing, getting into triathlon, and always trying to find my way, because the community that I grew up in didn't really have people wandering around like we do here in Colorado who knew about these things, but I really wanted to do them. And so I had to kind of figure it out, making a lot of mistakes along the way. And then the final chapter, the one I'm on now, after 30 years of running a research lab and publishing and writing grants and so forth, I decided to close my lab and make an effort to try to take some of the amazing science I was seeing in the brain science world, my world, and connect it with my passion for endurance sports, because I was seeing all this amazing research that had incredible implications for athletic performance kind of dying in dusty library journals without ever getting applied. And so in this last chapter of my career, I'm working with primarily elite endurance athletes very closely. I keep my stable of athletes really small to figure out how we can leverage what we know about the brain to improve their performance.
Wow. So, as you said, a lot of this knowledge is just kept within the university setting and not being actually applied. And then how does this relate to sports psychology? You're not a sports psychologist, but yet this is a sub track, if you will, within sports psychology that's actually not being taught, sounds like.
Yeah. So I'm not a sports psychologist. I think if people looked at some of the things I do with my athletes, they say, oh, imagery. Sports psychologists do that. Or working on internal dialogue and trying to get that to switch from being negative to positive. That's a sports psychology thing. And the answer is yes. But sports psychology never really invested that heavily in understanding mechanisms. And so for me, the key to all of this is understanding and coming from the perspective of what do we know about how the brain functions, and what does that suggest about the ways that we can harness behavioral techniques like imagery, or like reframing, or positive internal dialogue, in ways that would be conducive to improving performance. And I'll give you, if we get into it, we can talk about some examples of what mechanisms, what I mean by mechanisms.
Okay, so why would an athlete hire you? What is your value proposition you're bringing to their career?
Yeah. So the athletes that hire me generally have sought me out. I'm not big on the sort of advertising, because I like to keep things small, and that prevents a bit of a bar to entry, which is nice. The athletes who've sought me out come because they feel like they could be getting more out of themselves. They're already doing all the things.
Okay.
They've got the coach with a structured training plan that is really been refined over the years for their performance. As I said, they're typically pretty far along in their development as athletes. They're doing the nutritional stuff. They're leveraging things like heat and altitude training. They're on the best equipment, but still They're finding that there are things that are happening on the brain side that they feel are presenting obstacles to realizing their full potential.
Hmm. Okay, so now if we go more into the theory and the uniqueness of your practice, it's, I mean, brain fatigue, brain performance training. What, give us that
Yeah.
in a nutshell. Like, what is that theory behind what you're trying to manipulate?
Yeah. So if we think about what does the brain do? What is the job of the brain? Well, it's the central command and control center for all of our behavior. And by behavior, I mean the things we can see in terms of like our running, our cycling, our swimming, our skiing, whatever it happens to be. But I also mean your internal behavior. So all of your cognitive functions like perception, attention, emotion, decision making, task switching, error correction, all of these fundamental cognitive functions are also forms of behavior that we can measure objectively. And that's what experimental psychologists do. That's what I was trained to do. And as I was mentioning, once this new brain technology became available, like in the 90s, we started to be able to see what are the mechanisms underlying how people utilize their attention, or what's going on in the brain when someone is feeling overly aroused. What's going on in the brain when a person is listening to the chatter in their head, and how can we take an understanding of those brain mechanisms and leverage them in ways that will be performance enhancing rather than performance eroding, I
Yeah.
would say. Now, a big core of this comes from probably the biggest discovery in brain science in the last century, which is the realization that our brains are very responsive to training.
Hmm.
Uh, People in the audience may have heard the term neuroplasticity, the idea that the brain is responsive to stimulation. So if you think about the brain being an organ, and think about a muscle, for
Hmm.
example, if you put load on a muscle, you can drive adaptations in that muscle, provided you give it enough recovery, and you'll get stronger. The brain is like that too. If we exercise circuits in the brain in structured and deliberate ways, we can drive changes that will improve the efficiency of that circuitry and even drive changes that will be detectable in terms of the structure of those circuits.
Huh. So the resiliency of the brain, specifically within sports, what would that gain me as a cross country skier or a triathlete?
Yeah. So, some specific examples.
Yeah.
Arousal is a big issue in sports. We have known since the early 1900s that there's this kind of inverted U-shaped function between stress and performance. At very low levels of stress, tasks are too easy and you don't
Hmm.
get the most out of yourself. At very high levels of stress, we start to fall apart. What happens
Fear.
when you're highly stressed is you get fearful. Your attention switches from being able to be intentionally driven to the activity that you need to do strategically to being captured by sensations coming in through your sensory organs within your body and so forth. We talk about that as an athlete needing to get out of their head, right?
Yeah.
The sweet spot is somewhere in between those two, where there's just the right amount of stress. It's like, Goldilocks, right? The porridge too warm, the porridge too cold. Well, there's just the right warmth of porridge, just the right amount of arousal. We talk about that as an athlete's zone of optimal functioning. And it's different for every athlete. And one of the things that we know is that we can leverage certain behaviors to help regulate a person into their zone of optimal functioning. So we can take charge. What we're really doing is using our central nervous system, our brain, to take charge of the more automatic or autonomic nervous system functions. So people have probably heard about, you've got this thing, it's called the autonomic nervous system, and there's a sympathetic division that we talk about as the fight or flight, high arousal, and the parasympathetic division, which is more like rest and digest, and that the two of those are constantly kind of balancing one another out. And they literally are balancing one another out. I mentioned earlier that this amazing discovery about neuroplasticity means that if we engage in structured kinds of behavioral training, we can literally reshape the circuitry of our nervous system. This is a great example of that. So, a behavior that can change the level of arousal in your autonomic nervous system by harnessing your brain is breathing.
Mm.
Something that we do very automatically, but we can also take voluntary control over our breathing. So it's a little different than like many of the other automatic functions or autonomic functions in our body. But when you inhale, the balance tips in favor of the fight or flight system. There will be a little upregulation of your heart rate. When you exhale, there will be a tipping the balance just slightly in favor of your parasympathetic or rest or digest. So there's a tool that we can now leverage because we understand the mechanisms, getting back to the importance of mechanism. We can give people structured breathing exercises where we uh, manipulate the ratio of time they spend inhaling to exhaling. And it turns out that there's a ratio of about 0.5, where your inhales are about half as long as your exhales. So the exhale is twice as long as the inhale, will shift you into a lower arousal state. I'll give you another example that ties into this. Sometimes we might need to upregulate. Usually, I've yet to meet the athlete that needs to upregulate their arousal right before a competition. I'm sure they exist, but I haven't met them. So mostly we're doing the breath work to pull them down or to switch them off after hard training or competitions so they can start recovering. But what if you get up in the morning and you've got this, you open your TrainingPeaks and you say, whoa, look what the coach gave me. And I'm not really feeling that amped up. How can you upregulate your arousal? How can we increase the sympathetic activity? And one of the neat ways we can do that is by doing some kind of movements that engage the trunk muscles, the big trunk muscles, core muscles of our body. Because when we activate those core muscles, there are connections for them directly to the adrenal glands that sit on top of your kidneys. Activation of those trunk muscles will cause a release of adrenaline. Adrenaline will connect to these receptors that a lot of people aren't aware of that sit on the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve we hear about all the time um, is being kind of like putting the brakes on things, right? Calming things down, but it all actually can play a role in ramping things up if we put the brakes on the brake, right?
Right.
So this adrenaline gets released when you activate those core trunk muscles. It connects to the vagus nerve and kind of shuts things down. It takes the brakes off a little bit so the sympathetic can amp up. So a very practical tool here, right? Because we understand these mechanisms is we can use breath work to calm you down. We can use activation of your core trunk muscles to ramp you up and get you motivated to get out the door and do the thing that you need to do. Because we all know consistency is the most important principle of training. Um, and that all comes out of our understanding of how the nervous system works. Now, as I mentioned, there are real individual differences here. So people should go out and experiment with these things and see what works best for them. We can, using heart rate variability measures with an individual, start to discover what is the optimal rate of breathing and ratio of inhalation to exhalation to put them in a calmer state. And there's some individual variability, but something around 6 breath cycles per minute, give or take 1 or 2 in either direction, is where everyone is going to be. So people could start with 6, but you can also use if you have a good way to measure HRV, and it really needs to be a strap because you want to do it electroconductively. You can look for what timing of breathing and what ratio of inhalation to exhalation brings me into the highest HRV state, right? Where the parasympathetic is most active.
Yeah, that sounds like really acute to, giving people tools to use in the moment outside of exercise.
Yeah.
To help them recover or get ready for a hard workout, or if they need, get ready for a race, or maybe tone it down before a race. I've known people that can't eat breakfast before a race
or sleep
because they are their nerves are so high, and nervous. What about within the race itself?
Yeah.
So this brain fatigue, I mean, what how does that play a factor in terms of me reaching my goals within the race? And do I even know my brain is tired? I mean,
Yeah.
does it just happen to everybody?
Right.
Like, oh,
Yeah. So the paradox in all of this, right, is that we're using our brain to think about our brain. And that doesn't always lead to the best outcomes because we tend not to be all that objective, right? So yeah, you're spot on here. We've known for, since the late 1800s that if we give somebody hard work to do with their brain, their capacity for physical work goes down. And you can measure this in a lab with a variety of different techniques like lifting weights. Your strength will go down somewhat
with high cognitive load.
with high cognitive load. So you can sit your butt down into your desk all day, work, 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 and you're going to pay a price for that in your workout, right?
Right.
So another reason why you might want to contemplate whether you can fit your workout in before the end of the day, if possible. Yet another reason, right? So those early observations, quite compelling. They got lost to science. And they got kind of rediscovered in the last, I'd say, 25 years, partly sparked by Tim Noakes, the famous South African exercise scientist who started talking about the central governor. And the central governor idea, probably a lot of people are familiar with it, but the idea is that the brain is what puts the brakes on performance, to put it really simply in broad strokes. I think that we could argue a lot about the nuances of Tim's theory, and we could talk, as people like Sam Marcora have, and that's what academics and scientists do. But from the practical perspective, the concept is a good one. If our central nervous system isn't performing well, we're not going to perform well physically. If our central nervous system is carrying a load of fatigue, you're going to pay the price. None of us would go to our big goal race without tapering. I think it is a fair assertion, because we know from the research that if you taper, on average, you can expect something like a 2 to 3% improvement in performance.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the higher level athlete you are, the more important those percentages become. How many of the athletes that you know also do a taper on their cognitive or brain load in the weeks leading into
I mean, I've never heard anyone talk about it.
Yeah, you and I probably don't do it, right? And we're both athletes. Um, it's low-hanging fruit that we're leaving on the table. And I'll tell you, I work with Olympic athletes, I work with professional athletes who are paying the bills through their sports, almost entirely endurance athletes, although I do work with some alpine skiers and some pickleball athletes now, which has become a very big thing. It's pro, man, and there's probably more money
on
in it.
TrainingPeaks.
Yeah, I'm sure it is too, and there's probably more. It's probably much more lucrative than a trail
It's on
racing
TV.
or something.
Come on.
Yeah, it's on TV exactly. You know, it's a novel idea to most of the athletes I work with that we need to taper that kind of cognitive load, and that can involve planning. Right. So even an amateur athlete with a family and a job, which you and I have always been, I guess you had a time when you were younger where you're racing as a pro. I've always been an amateur athlete. We can look at our life and figure out what things we can let go of. Do we really need to spend that time on social media? Well, what if we just put that away until after the race? Right? What are the things that we can let go of? Probably can't, kind of get rid of the family for a week or whatever. Probably not too practical, but there are probably things you can plan. Whereas most of the amateur athletes I know, and certainly true of me, is like, great, I'm not going to be on the bike 15 hours this week, so I'll just double down on work.
Yeah.
That's a mistake.
Yeah.
And there are now probably 80 peer-reviewed published studies showing that if we induce central fatigue in individuals, physical performance goes down, critical power goes down, time to exhaustion goes down, strength, speed, they're all affected. Because your brain, again, is the central command and control center for everything. And yet, and this is also a funny thing, I mean, sports science has been traditionally a very neck down or shoulders down sort of enterprise, right?
Yeah.
But any coach will tell you that the brain is vitally important for getting the most out of yourself on the day. So we can start to have better hygiene for our central load. And we can use some of the metrics in TrainingPeaks, for example. The two of my favorites that really I think correlate most with brain fatigue are simply what's your mood and how motivated are you to train.
That's the two I was going to pick.
Yeah, if I could only get two pieces of data from my athletes about their central fatigue, that's what I'd get. Now, I have a luxury because, as I'll explain in a minute, I give cognitive training exercises to my athletes that allow me to get performance metrics, speed,
Right.
accuracy, and variation. Variation in performance is a really
through tools you're using through.
Yeah, through software.
Okay.
So I set up these tasks and I push them out to their iPhone or iPad.
Got it.
And a typical training session for them will be to actively be doing these kind of cognitive training tasks where they might be making 60 different decisions
during the workout.
Well, that's a key point. So I'll get there.
Okay.
The tasks are structured in a way where I can choose how to load the brain. For example, we can load perceptual processes more, or decision making. We can load task switching or error recovery. We can load attention, and I can individually adjust the parameters of these tasks to put weight on different brain circuits that control all those performance critical functions. Okay. So typically what would happen is my athlete comes to me, we do a kind of baseline testing to get their fingerprint, because we're all different. Yeah. Every brain is different. And then we identify how we're going to structure our training to best address building up their weak spots, maintaining or building on their strengths. And then I design a program for them that I push out to their phone. Your question is really prescient. So when do they do the training? How do they do the training? Because we know that central fatigue impairs these kind of functions, which you need to perform well in a race. And we can talk about that. Cycling is a great example. Talk about that. We typically will have at least some of our sessions where they're coming in, let's say from an over distance session on the bike. They walk in, get some dry clothes on, grab a bottle, and do exactly what they least want to do, which is sit down and spend 25 minutes banging through tasks where they may be under a lot of pressure. They may be having to make a lot of decisions, maybe one a second, which really adds up when we start talking about 20 minutes of training when they're in this kind of high fatigue state.
Yeah.
What we know about learning in the brain, and this gets back to mechanism, is that learning is really context specific. So if we want a pro cyclist to be able to very quickly be able to evaluate the situation and the dynamic in the peloton, make a rapid decision whether to go or not go, we need to be training those functions when they're fatigued, just like it's going to go down in the race, right? So harness that context specificity. We're also doing some things now where we're kind of creating, I call them like HIIT workouts for the brain, where we're interleaving very brief but super intense, like 1 minute brain training sessions between sets in the gym or on the indoor trainer. As some of us, are moving inside for cycling in the winter, or runners are moving onto the treadmill. We've also done it that way. Hard to do this in the field. But we can incorporate it, and everything I'm telling you right now, there are research papers, and people can go. I try to keep the website reasonably updated. They can go and see I try to get the latest research on there. But if we do these things consistently, what we can expect are two things. We can expect these core cognitive, performance critical cognitive functions to become more fatigue resistant. So they show up during the race when we need them, which is important in any of our endurance sports, including ultras. I have a number of ultra runners I work with. Man, what happens to them? The legs might still be going, but the brain starts to unravel, right? We can also, from the research, see that your rate of perceived exertion goes down a bit. And what we know from brain science about perceived exertion is really interesting. There is a network in our brain that registers central fatigue, and it overlaps highly with the areas of the brain involved in computing perceived exertion. So when you're centrally fatigued, the connectivity and how well these areas of the brain talk to one another is altered. And behaviorally, what happens is your perceived exertion for a given effort goes up. When our perceived exertion goes up, the cost benefit ratio for the activity we're doing is altered. So we start to think, wow, this is not really worth it anymore.
The reward.
The reward is diminished in value,
Right.
and motivation starts to go down. And when you're in a state of high perceived exertion, you're in the sympathetic activation arousal state. That has an amplifying effect on all the pain signals that are coming in from the muscles and all these interoceptive signals that we're getting from our body. And basically, what does your brain do? Well, like Tim Noakes said, it starts to govern your behavior. It starts to slow you down. So there's all of this understanding. And look, it's far from complete at this point, but we know enough. And this is what prompted me to walk away from the world's most secure job, right? Tenured, endowed professor. I mean, that's pretty locked in. And move into this world was my enthusiasm for seeing some of this science get out there and affect performance. And so, yeah, that's it.
I mean, that's why I kind of got excited when I delve more into this research and, and what you're doing and all, because it does make so much sense, but yet it is not really being taught or thought of. Yet it's understandable. We can all relate to that. But I also think it's not just about like, am I going to make a 2 or 3% improvement? I think of it almost binary, because your example in an ultra, I mean, I've had examples within a long 7-hour race where I make a really bad decision about my equipment choice at that point of the course, which then caused me to crash or whatever, or I lost 5 more minutes, or I lost the front group because I was not thinking about what's upcoming. The course looks like this. I knew that ahead of time, the night before the race, the morning of the race, but I completely blanked out and forgot it during the race. And hence, before I got to that point in the course, I made the wrong decision on getting my poles out, for example, or in ski mountaineering, like I literally started a descent with my brake on, and I crashed 3 times before I realized
what's going on here.
My brake is not locked. So it's like, it's almost binary. It's like, well, I didn't, in those cases, I did not improve at all by 2 or 3%, but I lost by 4%. You know what I mean? So these decision-making points in the course, if you're not thinking clearly, they'll just pass you by.
Yeah, that's right. And you're an elite cyclist, so you know that cycling is sort of, in terms of endurance sports, I think probably the most intense example of where even slight glitches or slowing down of cognitive function has big ramifications for performance, right? You've got that moment where you've got to make the decision to go or not go. And if you don't do it, then you may have missed the train, and it's very hard to get back on once you're off.
Right? Yeah. Again, back to ultra, I think the front group of elite runners has some of those decisions in the early moments of the race, or key moments, at night, if someone's surging, do I go? But the majority of the field is doing their own race, doing their own pacing. But when you're racing truly against others, and in cycling, you're drafting. If you don't hold that draft, you're going to lose 20 minutes. So I need to hold this draft. But you also have to think about the wind direction. And we're going to make a turn here, and where is the wind direction going to come from, in 2 minutes time, and where am I positioned in the group, and do I need to move within the group to be better prepared for 2 minutes from now? So there's a lot of that dynamic stuff happening, but yet I'm not an ultra runner, but I'm sure they have a lot of the same kind of decision making. It's nutrition. It was cold last night. I didn't eat properly. It was raining and snowing at the top of the pass at 2 a.m. and I missed completely, whatever it might be. Like, how do I recuperate and come back? But you need to be on top of it and thinking. And so you believe that through these protocols, you can actually see improvement. You can track improvement in brain fatigue.
Yeah, no, I do. And my belief comes from two things. It comes from a growing literature and science where people bring things into the lab, as I did for 30 years, and control all the variables they can control to try to test the hypothesis, right?
Yeah,
That
yeah.
the intervention works. And I saw this research developing, I'd say over the last probably getting close to 20 years now. When I was an active scientist, I thought, man, I just don't buy it. And then it accumulated to the point where my skepticism had to be put aside and I had to start taking it seriously. And the other source of reality here is what I've seen with individual athletes that I work with. And look, science is based on averages. We do a scientific study, let's say, of a new medication, and we test it against placebo. And even if it doesn't do better than placebo on average, there'll be some people who responded really
Right.
well to that medicine. And we don't know who that is beforehand. Likewise, if the drug is like fantastic, beats the placebo, is going to make everyone billions of dollars, there are people that don't respond to it.
Mhm.
The interventions that we do with athletes, and coaches know this, there are responders and non-responders. We
Yeah.
see this like in altitude training, for example, is an easy one to think about.
Yeah.
Some people are much more responsive to that
Yeah.
than others. Well, the brain training is no different than that. Um, and I think it requires fiddling around and trying new things. And so you asked me earlier who are the athletes that I work with and where do they come from? And they generally have to be curious people and want to know, not just tell me what to do, but want to know why. And they're willing to experiment. They're willing to try things, some of which don't work and some of which do work really well. The sort of overriding point that I'd like to make is that these things that we've thought about as untrainable or that they're byproducts of physical workouts, we really need to question that. And there are implications coming from brain science about how we might look at training a little bit differently. And I'll give you one quick example. A typical workout, let's say for a cyclist in who's trying to develop their VO2 max, might be the dreaded 5 by 5 minutes, right?
Mhm.
We've all done them. They're terrible. I hate them, but I get a big bump from them. I'm a responder. The trouble with those in terms of how relevant they are to the context of bike racing is that they're entirely known entities. And what I mean by that is they're completely predicted by the athlete. The athlete knows, okay, 4 minutes 38 seconds, I've only got 22 seconds to go. I can do this. That's not how bike races work.
Yeah.
Bike races are really demanding cognitively. And one of the reasons is other people are in control of how much you're suffering, and how long you've got to hang on is an unknown entity. And you talk to pro bike racers, and I'm sure you could say many examples of this yourself, is like, how many times have you decided, no more, I can't do it? You pop, only to look up the road and see the pack slow down in 10 seconds, right? If you could have made 10 more pedal strokes, you might have been there. We need to train in a way that helps develop that ability to handle uncertainty and unpredictability, which, what does it do? It raises arousal and anxiety. So well, we may get a big bump from the 5 by 5s. Maybe some of the time we should introduce some variability in them. We should cover up the clock on the head unit, for example. Very mindlessly simple thing. I generally have great relationships with my athletes' coaches, so I always try to get some buy-in for doing some things like that too.
Yeah.
And then at the foundation of all this, right, are the basic things that if they're not in place, none of the brain training, none of the unpredictable intervals and things matter, which is the athlete has to be comfortable in their skin. They can't have their entire identity riding on the result sheet. They've got to have a fairly stable kind of life off the bike or off the skis, or out of the running shoes. And I also work with them on those kinds of
Yeah.
things, which would be the more traditional kind of realm of sports psych.
But I think for all amateurs, age groupers, I mean, what you said earlier, could have effect on their racing. I think about deloading, deloading the
Yeah.
brain, tapering. We all understand tapering. They're even age groupers, amateurs they understand tapering, showing up fresh, not tired. Well, hence, shouldn't I do the same thing for my brain? And I think about travel days,
Ooh. Yeah.
right? Like, when do you plan your travel day? Can we plan travel 2 or 3 days out from the race? Like, that's
Yeah.
a deload. Like, there are other examples of like how to deload race week.
Yeah. And it's not all rocket science. It's not even all brain science, although the brain is the impetus behind doing this, right? I'll give you another quick one. So this is something people can do experiment with them for themselves. So in our work in the brain imaging lab, we would create these tasks where we would look at what areas are involved when people produce speech. And there's a well-known network of areas in your left hemisphere, predominantly for most people, that is your speech dominant hemisphere. You could have a stroke in your left hemisphere. One of the most common effects is aphasia. You have trouble with speech. Well, it turns out that if we give people tasks that require them to activate their internal dialogue, really ramp that up. So I might give them a letter and say, mentally generate, talk to yourself, all the animals that whose names start with A, something like that, right? And we do this a bunch of times. We look at the network. That internal dialogue is using the same network that speech production is, okay?
Yeah.
Except for the output part. So when you're out there in, your 58K into your 60K ultra or whatever your jam is, and those thoughts are starting to come, which are not generally flattering for your performance. For most of us, that's the brain trying to put the governor on. It can do that in a lot of ways. And one of them is to start eroding our self-confidence, right? The negative loops start going, the rumination
Yeah.
kicks up. Try talking out loud, because you
Oh.
can't talk out loud and talk inside and have two different dialogues going on at the same
I was going to
time.
ask you about mantras.
It'll pull you right out. And that's one of the reasons mantras work,
Okay.
especially if you say them out loud.
Got it.
You don't need to yell them at the top of your lungs, but you might want to try that. It might
Think about tennis players yelling at themselves on the court all the time.
it might get in the head of your competitors a little bit. Endurance sports tend to be a little more genteel.
That wacky guy.
Yeah, exactly. You'll get a little more space in the peloton. But there's a neurophysiological mechanism that suggests a solution to this problem. It's very effective. Try it out.
Yeah, I also think I've personally, sometimes I'll be hard into a ride and for some reason I'll be thinking nutrition, and it's like 25 grams per packet. How many packets have I had? I've had 6, and I can't multiply 6 times what, like, I'm like,
Yeah.
the simple math goes out the window.
Yeah. You don't want to be signing any important legal documents or taking out a mortgage or something.
But
after your long ride.
That is like absolutely, like, I literally can't do this simple math.
Right. So your brain is the biggest energy hog in your body. It counts for about 20% of your daily metabolic energy consumption, even though it's about 2% of your body weight, right? And that's true. And people get this wrong all the time. They're like, oh, I work my brain really hard. I need to fuel it better. No, the amount of fluctuation in the amount of calories that thing is burning through doesn't change. It changes infinitesimally depending on whether you're laying on the couch watching Netflix or, solving astrophysics formulas or something like that. Those are really hard changes to measure. We have to have like multi-million-dollar devices to be able to do that. But given that we know that the brain has this huge energy consumption behind it, we need to realize that when fuel starts to get low, the brain will start to throw up signals very early that there's a problem. And it'll be the first thing. Even before you get anywhere near of running out of fuel,
Right.
the brain will start budgeting things differently. Your cognitive functions, like your ability to do math or remember a phone number, will start to go down. Generally, the first sign I see in athletes is their mood starts to go down.
Yeah.
So if you start to feel a little bit low, just a little bit low, boy, you better start slamming some calories pretty quickly. It's giving you a signal before things get into a bad state, because it's always trying to keep us alive. It's always trying to protect us. And your brain is doing a lot of this automatically in the background. I liken it to an iceberg. The part of the iceberg above the water is tiny compared to the amount under the amount above the water is what we're consciously aware of what's going on, this little thing that we call consciousness, which is
Yeah.
really small. Most of what the brain is doing is happening below the waterline of consciousness.
Yeah. Hmm. Going back to assessment, I
Mhm.
mean, as a coach, I think endurance, strength, speed,
Yeah,
muscular endurance, power,
sure.
anaerobic endurance. I kind of, there's those six, abilities. There's basic abilities and advanced abilities. Like, where are we? What's the weakness? How am I mapping this athlete? What are some of these abilities, that you're mapping out
Yeah,
within the assessment?
yeah. So, so I'll give you a list of those, then I'll tell you how we monitor central fatigue, which I think you'll find
Hmm.
interesting because we all love measurement, right? Um, the kind of core things are like perception or situational awareness, right?
Mm.
The information we're taking through
Yeah.
mainly through our eyes and our ears, but it's also through interoception, the internal monitoring of your temperature and your breath rate and those things. And a lot of that is non-conscious, but it's
Right.
informing the decisions that your brain is making. The ability to switch quickly between two different streams of thought, or task switching, as we might call it,
Yeah.
super important to have
Yeah.
that kind of fluidity, right? Cognitive fluidity. So you've got a goal, you've got a plan, but boy, you need to adapt that plan on the fly in the middle of the
A,
race.
B, C plan. Yeah.
For sure. And
Yeah.
we talk about, I'm always on my athletes about every workout, and probably most coaches, right? Every workout, every race, let's have some clear intentions.
Right.
But boy, you better be ready to switch those up if the race dynamic develops differently than what we
The
thought about.
weather.
The weather, the competition, maybe someone went out super hard and you have to decide whether you're going to go with them, or you find yourself in the lead and you didn't intend to be. What do? Do you wait? Do you sit up? There's just like a million things. We can't plan for all of them. So task switching is very
Mhm.
important. Attentional focus, focal attention, our ability to intentionally focus on the things that are important without getting distracted by the things that aren't. It's another thing that goes, all of these things are compromised when the brain is tired. Rapid decision making, right? So, when I've been out in these long training things, it's like you're talking about the math, you just sort of like get stuck and you go into the aid station, watch what people do in races, go like the long gravel
Yeah. Right.
races. People go into I've
With
done
no
this.
intention. Yeah.
No, you go into the aid station and suddenly it's like 4 minutes are gone. Like, wow.
Well, also rapid decision making. I think about crashes.
Oh,
And
for sure.
I've been through like 5 different crashes this year. Like, how do you react?
Right. And the more tired mentally you are, the less we can measure in the
Reaction.
lab, the slower you're going to be. Right. So all of those things, and there's a bunch of these. These are really core cognitive functions. They involve somewhat distinct networks in the brain. We can develop tasks that stimulate those behaviors and drive those changes in the brain by loading those areas
Uh-huh.
and providing proper recovery afterwards. So it's the same principles that we use in training: periodization, progression, individualization, recover and adapt.
Okay.
Okay.
On the individualization, we have our own strengths and weaknesses. I mean, you are mapping someone and you are like, aha,
Yeah,
here's a black hole we got
that's
to
right.
work on.
That's right. So, just like if we brought somebody and did a bunch of physical assessments,
Yep.
some people are more agile than other people. Some people's balance has a lot of room for improvement. Some people might have a high VO2 max, but they're not that good at really hard, high power anaerobic efforts. We don't just say, well, there's your fingerprint and good luck. We'll figure out what you can do with what
Right.
you got. We figure out the best way to train the things to make the weaknesses into strengths if we can, right? And to build on those strengths. So it's the same with the brain. Um, we want to be able also, though, when we're doing this training, to measure how people are adapting. And that's a big thing in all training. And you might think, well, cognitive fatigue, like how can we measure that? I mentioned that we can ask people for subjective ratings, and those are valuable. What the athlete thinks, it matters a lot, right?
Yeah.
And we could get into that, but it would probably pull us way over time. When I at the beginning of every cognitive training session my athletes do, they do a very short test, takes about 90 seconds, which is very sensitive to their cognitive fatigue. 1 or 2 times doesn't tell me much, but I have data now, over months, and I can see, like 4 days in a row, they're getting slower. Maybe their accuracy
Is
is
this a
off.
daily test?
No, we usually train 3 to 4 times a week.
Okay.
Yeah. With the cognitive stuff. So I've got a way of tracking cognitive fatigue, increases your response times, lowers your accuracy, increases your variability. But another really interesting one is a metric that probably a lot of people listening to this already use, which is heart rate variability. Heart rate variability, I was talking about how it's tied to this autonomic system, is not only affected by physical fatigue, it's also affected by central nervous system fatigue. Your central nervous system does a poor job of regulating the parasympathetic sympathetic balance when it's tired. It doesn't do as well. And so I'm keen on getting a kind of regular HRV measure,
like a morning
like a
measurement?
morning HRV and resting heart rate. Doesn't take, just a few minutes, less than a handful of minutes, but that's another part
Are
of
you
the
finding
puzzle.
value from wearables that just automatically do it?
Yes. But without kind of getting into brands or whatever, I think the critical things here are that the wearable is a strap where we're getting like electrocardiography, rather than a ring or something, or a pulse-based measure. It's just, we want to be tied to the original signal. For this work. And then, there's a lot of information in heart rate variability. We all know about like RMSSD. That's great. But we also look at high frequency and low frequency components, some of which are more indicative of central fatigue. So this is all the kind of stuff. And you can start to see why I keep the stable of athletes small. There's a lot of different things that we can be doing.
Well, it's
and
individualized coaching.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What about the effect of age? Here we are,
I feel targeted.
I said we. Targeting myself
You're a
as
young
well.
man.
The effect of age, is that been studied, or intuitions? Would have first-hand experience?
Yeah, so age is really interesting, and here's what I'll say. I think this kind of focus on the brain side of performance becomes increasingly important as we age, because like it or not, no matter how diligent you are in your training, your physicality goes down. Your VO2 max, we can slow the trends, but we're not going to stop them. It's going down. So what are the other things we can be doing to compensate for some of those changes? Well, if we look to there's a really big literature on expertise in psychology. And what you see is generally, it's kind of a bummer. Your brain gets slower and more, in that general slowing can compromise these core performance critical cognitive functions, except when someone is an expert. Experts can use their own knowledge about how their brain works, right? I've been living with this thing for 60 years. I kind of have a good sense of its strengths and weaknesses. I know the things that I'm good at, and I know the things that I'm not good at, and I can leverage my strengths to compensate for some of the slowing that's accompanying aging. And if we train these kind of systems, they will show up better for us even when we're aging in performance. And hopefully, and look, I have no data to say this, but I think that they will help to slow the erosion of performance, right?
Right. How about, to kind of turning the page here, you're building up a lot of expertise as well within, and you have, I guess, a special interest in concussions and coming back from concussions. So kind of really flipping the script here, and still brain centered, but concussion rehab protocol has been changing. How'd you get involved in this work, and what kind of new research are you seeing?
Yeah. So getting back to the theme, I think a theme of this conversation, I'm a huge believer that we get insights on how to fix problems when we come at them mechanistically. When we understand the underlying mechanisms, we get ideas about how to address them. Concussion is a fantastic example. We've already talked about some of the mechanisms. So I got interested in this. I'll tell you just quickly. An athlete I was working with, professional triathlete, multi-time Olympian, had a terrible bike accident and woke up in an ambulance, not knowing how she got there. And so I had months of brain training for her. I knew what her fingerprint looked like. I knew where she was at in terms of all these core cognitive functions. And so after the acute recovery phase, I retested her and I said, and I could see the things that weren't affected and I could see the things that were significantly affected. And in this case, short-term memory, working memory was really compromised, but attentional focus, not too bad, right? Task switching was somewhat affected. So I had an idea of, wow, where should we target our energy for rehabilitation? Because I had this fingerprint of this athlete.
Right.
When you get a concussion, you don't need to, first thing I'd like people to know is you don't need to hit your head. You just need to hit the ground and decelerate the brain quickly enough, having it hit the inside of the skull. We used to think that people needed to diminish all sensory input and rest the brain. We call it cocooning. They, put them in a dark spot and just like, don't deal with that. The thinking is really changing rapidly. Within the first 24 to 48 hours, that it may be good to kind of get some rest. But as soon as a person can tolerate it, a really good thing to do is get back to some movement in aerobic exercise.
If they're not injured, let's state that, right?
Yeah, if they're not injured. That's exactly right. Thank you for pointing that out. When we exercise aerobically, two things happen. We increase the rest and digest parasympathetic recovery side of that autonomic nervous system balance, and we increase blood flow to the brain, both of which are good things for getting the brain functioning good again. Exercise is probably the biggest thing to reestablish regulation of the parasympathetic. A huge kind of revolution, our understanding of the effects of concussion are that when we have this kind of a concussive insult to the brain, the autonomic nervous system goes out of whack. The sympathetic arousal portion gets way ramped up. People have trouble sleeping. People have anxiety and depression that they didn't have before. And they're wondering, like, what the hell is going on? Well, it's your sympathetic nervous system in overdrive. So we need to get you moving as soon as we can if you're physically capable of that. There's a lovely protocol from colleagues at the University of Buffalo, which essentially amounts to a tolerance test, kind of like a ramp test, but you take someone up to the level at which they start to feel concussive symptoms. This could be on a treadmill or a bike. We don't send you out like, okay, get on your roller skis or go out and ride in traffic. Yeah. We nice, safe environment. As soon as we trigger any symptoms, they start to get a headache, they start to get dizzy, you back it down, and then you say, well, 80% of that, we can have you exercise 80% of that, and then you gradually test, progress, and bring it up. And we try to harness that neuroplasticity by getting the brain gradually and progressively working on some of those areas that have been compromised again.
Wow. I mean, this athlete was very fortunate to have worked with you prior.
Completely accidental.
It'd be ideal if we all had that experience prior to, knock on wood, having a crash, getting concussed. But can we go about getting baseline data on ourselves?
Yeah.
So in the unfortunate event this happens, we actually have something that we can refer back to and see different levels of where we might need to improve or how far off we are.
Yeah. So I think we could do a lot better job than we're currently doing on that. So the UCI has a concussion protocol now, which is a step forward. It uses something called the SCAT, and I can't remember what the acronym stands for. But the whole idea of that was to get some baseline testing and then be able to deliver this at the side of the road when a rider has an accident. I think in practice, there are a lot of problems with the SCAT. I don't think it's that sensitive. I think these tasks where we're getting like response time and accuracy and we're putting loads on different cognitive functions are a lot more sensitive to those sorts of changes. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of room here if someone wanted to go out and say, "Hey, I'm going to make an app that people can do, 15 minutes of testing on their phone. We save their data, and in the unfortunate situation where they ever do have a concussive injury, 20% of all concussions in the US are bicycle related, right? So if you ride a bike, you're at high risk of concussion. Um, then we can retest and we
So
can
you
have
haven't
an
seen
idea.
this?
I haven't seen this. Maybe
Wow.
somebody's done it.
I thought that would exist by now.
Seems like low-hanging fruit.
Maybe it does. Well, we'll have to find out.
Sounds like a good one for training.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like especially cyclists, triathletes, skiers.
Yeah,
I mean,
no
come
kidding.
on, like how many millions of
Even
people?
Nordic skiers, I'm a
Yeah.
big Nordic skier. I've had accidents where I've hit the ground really hard, and I know athletes who've gotten concussed doing that. Skimo, right?
Yeah.
So you do a lot of that.
Broke my leg instead of hitting my head.
Oh,
but,
yeah. I don't know. Well, the good news is that legs heal. I'm healing my broken femur.
Brains
as we
heal
speak.
too, it sounds like.
Brains heal, but they don't heal in the same way that legs do. We don't have the capacity in our central nervous system, our brain and spinal cord, to regenerate cells.
Okay.
We can osteoblast to generate new bone. But the way brains heal is that they can reorganize themselves a bit and make use of undamaged areas. And in most concussions, we're not actually killing brain cells, but we're kind of think of a way, probably colleagues would roll their eyes, but it's like you're stunning them a little bit, right? And they will come back online. But the brain has about, let's just say 85 billion neurons. Each one of them is connected to as many as 10,000 others. So it's an astronomically large number of synapses or connections between neurons, highly interconnected network. There's more than one network path between all those neurons to solve the different kind of equations, right? And we can stimulate that reorganization through this kind of training. Neuroplasticity, again, as we started our conversation on.
Yeah. Scott, thank you so much. I mean, like I said, I was really excited coming into this conversation. So much of it does make sense, but yet still is foggy.
Yeah.
But also I want to learn more about it. So how can people learn more? I mean, follow you putting out content? What's it look like?
Yeah, well, I also should just say, since I'm here sitting in TrainingPeaks with Dirk Friel, that I make use of TrainingPeaks with most of my athletes are on TrainingPeaks, and I can see how to schedule their brain training into their workouts.
And you work with their coach?
Yeah, I don't write training plans, but generally have good dialogue with my athletes' coaches. I'm part of the performance team, and TrainingPeaks is a great way for all of us to stay in touch and communicate. I get those metrics that I use along with my other metrics, and it's really been fun watching how that's evolved over the years.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah. So people can reach out to me through my website, which is cerebralperformance.com. There's a way to send me a message there. But if that's not, and I try to put a lot of research on there, and they can learn more about who I am and what I do and so on and so forth. They can always just send me an email. I try to be really good about responding to that. Scott@cerebralperformance.com.
Wow. Thank you so much, Scott. That's awesome. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it, Dirk. Nice to meet you finally.
Thanks for listening to Endurance Unlimited. Be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us on your platform of choice to never miss new episodes. Also, be sure to leave a 5-star rating to let your coach and the algorithm know you're ready to dial in your training. Find more resources to help you take on your next challenge at TrainingPeaks.com, or find us on social media at TrainingPeaks. Got questions? Leave a comment or send an email to podcast@trainingpeaks.com. Good luck in whatever you're training for, and trust the process to reach your potential.